Good morning. Those of you who have children should have received an email this week from Kelly. We are adults, teens, and children all working through Genesis together. When Advent starts up, we'll be in Advent texts together. Sometimes we're not able to make class where that content is shared, and so Kelly has started a weekly series of emails so that you parents have at least the gist of the content that's covered in class each week so that you can cover it on your own. So we hope that you'll take advantage of that. We continue our series in the book of Genesis this morning in a strange text in Genesis chapter 15. My stepfather and mother were visiting last week for the first time since we moved here a year and a half ago, and so we played tourist with them all last week. We toured up and down the Hudson Valley. We went to the cloisters. We walked on the High Line and went to the little island and Chelsea Marketplace. We spent some time in Kent, Connecticut, and we spent several hours in the Met looking at art from all over the world. And one of the pieces that we looked at was this piece by Salvador Dali called Crucifixion, or Corpus Hypercubus. And it is a rather unusual depiction of the scene of the death of Jesus, as much for what's not there as for what is there. And because many of us come from a more Protestant background, it may be a little more difficult for us to appreciate what's not there. We're used to crosses, the shape of the cross, rather than crucifixes, the visual representation of Jesus on the cross. But especially if we could zoom in on this, we'd see there are no nails in the hands of this Jesus. There are no nails in the feet of this Jesus. There is no bloody wound in his side. There are no grieving followers beneath him. The figure in the painting is actually Gala, the wife of Salvador Dali, who is mesmerized by the pure athletic body of Jesus as he hangs upon the cross in triumph and in victory. And there is a lot going on in this painting, but one of the things that is not going on is a sense of suffering, a sense of pain, a sense of cost, a sense of blood, a sense of death. And that's unfortunate because above all, the cross is a place of suffering, of pain, of cost, of blood, of death. And this is one reason why one writer, James Cone, in a book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree, has suggested that the lynching tree in American history, this place of death for many people of color between 1880 and 1940 in our own country, might be an appropriate contemporary image for us to use as we meditate upon the cross. And so he quotes Jack Martin, who writes, "The crucifix is a violently obscene icon. To recover its visceral power, children of the 21st century must imagine a lynching." Cone goes on to write this: "Jesus did not die a gentle death like Socrates with his cup of hemlock. Rather, he died like a lynched black victim or a common black criminal in torment on the tree of shame. The crowd's shout, 'Crucify him!' anticipated the white mob's shout, 'Lynch him!' Jesus' agonizing final cry of abandonment from the cross, 'My God, why have you forsaken me?' was similar to the lynched victim Sam Hose's awful scream as he drew his last breath, 'Oh my God, oh Jesus!' In each case, it was a cruel, agonizing, contemptible death." Now, Cone's not trying to be melodramatic. He's not trying to shock us. He's not trying to be crude. He's attempting to refresh our understanding of the cross as a place of blood, of death, of pain, and of cost. He's trying to push us to no longer sanitize the cross in the way that we consider it, even visually in our minds or even on our walls. And our text this morning in Genesis 15 is doing the very same thing. It is pushing us. It is not a pleasant text. It is an uncomfortable text. It is not the text that I would choose for us to sit with on a nice fall morning in Connecticut. But it is a text that actually helps reveal something about the cross of Christ. It is a text that helps reveal something about the nature of God. Our text comes in the middle of a conversation between God and Abram. We remember from last Sunday that God has invited Abram on a trip. And this trip is designed to resolve all the issues that have come up because of the tree and the dirt. God's invited him to go on a trip, to go to a land that God will show him. And from there, God will make his name great, and God will make of him a great nation. And through that great nation, all the families of the earth will be blessed. But here in Genesis 15, there's a problem because Abram is old, and Sarai, his wife, is old. And there are no children of which to make a great nation. There is no land yet of which to make a great nation. And it's out of this absence, it's out of this lack, it's out of this barrenness that Abram begins to question God. But Abram said, "O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." And Abram said, "You've given me no offspring, so a slave born in my house is to be my heir." Then he said to him, "I am the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess." But he said, "O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it?" It's often when we experience barrenness in our own lives. It's often when we experience a lack in our own lives, when there's some deep longing or want that's unfulfilled, that we become just like Abram, that we begin to question God. How can I know that God's going to carry through with his promise? How can I know that God's got my back? How can I know that God's going to stand by my side? How can I trust that God's going to be there for me? How can I know that God is with me? And so it's in the context of this absence, of this barrenness, Abram's and ours. It's in the context of questions about God's reliability and trust that we enter into this very strange scene. God requests that an ancient ceremony be conducted. And as part of this ancient ceremonies, animals are killed. They are sacrificed. They're cut into bloody pieces. It's a gory, bloody scene filled with death. There's nothing comfortable about the scene. It almost feels inappropriate to even bring up on a Sunday morning. And then in the form of a fire pot, in the form of a flaming torch, God moves through this bloody path between the parts of the animals that had been slaughtered and sacrificed. Now, God didn't invent this ritual. This ritual didn't come from the dark recesses of God's mind. God's using something that was common in that day. If Abram and God were having this conversation and Abram was raising these questions today, God would have done something very different. But it was done then. And so God uses a ceremony that was common in the world of antiquity. For example, we know from history and archaeology of a number of Hittite treaties from the 14th century to the 12th century BC between a king and a vassal. And as part of that ceremony, this covenant, this formal entering into a relationship together, there was the bloody sacrifice of an animal. And the sacrifice of that animal was intended to communicate in some way that if the vassal broke the terms of this formal relationship between the two of them, they could expect to be treated like this animal. Or we have from the 8th century BC a document recording a covenant, an agreement between a king and a vassal, and as part of that document, this statement is said, "As this calf is cut up, thus the vassal and his nobles shall be cut up." In other words, as part of formally entering into relationship, a calf was sacrificed. And that bloody sacrifice was a visceral reminder that if this vassal violates the terms of this new relationship, they could expect death, as this animal has met death. And that's why in Hebrew and in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the phrase to make a covenant is literally to cut a covenant. The word cut occurs 90 times in our Old Testaments in the Hebrew Bible in reference to making covenants. Because covenants weren't just made. Agreements to enter formally into relationships weren't just made, they were cut. They were accompanied with the killing, the sacrifice of an animal. Again, it was a visceral way of parties acknowledging that this relationship will be costly. This relationship may be painful. This relationship may be messy. And we enter into this relationship with our eyes wide open to that. We find this in Jeremiah chapter 34. "And those who transgressed my covenant and did not keep the terms of the covenant that they made before me, I will make like the calf when they cut it in two and passed between its parts. The officials of Judah, the officials of Jerusalem, the eunuchs, the priests, and all the people of the land who passed between the parts of the calf shall be handed over to their enemies and to those who seek their lives. Their corpses shall become food for the birds of the air and the wild animals of the earth." Apparently, the leaders of the nation of Judah have entered into a covenant, an agreement, an official relationship with God. And as part of that relationship, this animal was sacrificed. It was cut up. And now that they violated the terms of that agreement, there's the sense that they too should be treated in the way that the animal was treated. And so that's what we find happening in Genesis chapter 15. God and Abram officially entering into a formal relationship, and animals being sacrificed, bloody, gruesome, death, as a way of signifying that this relationship will be costly. This relationship will hurt. And yet, the unexpected piece of this text in Genesis 15 is that God is the only one who passes between the parts of the sacrificed animals. Abram is sidelined. He is placed to sleep, and God alone in the form of the smoking fire pot as the flaming torch passes through this bloody scene of sacrificed animals. And it seemed to be God's way of saying, "Abram, I am so committed to you. I'm so committed to our shared purpose of bringing blessing to all the families of the earth that I will risk even death to make sure that it happens. God is so committed to Abram. God is so committed to us and our shared purpose of bringing blessing to all the families of the earth that he willingly risks death in order to see it through. Now, why does God do this? God has no need within himself to do this. It's not like God's courage is flagging. It's not like God's the one that's raising the questions here. God does this for our sake. He does this because we are all Abram. And when we are in those seasons when all that we can think is, how can I know? How can I know that God's going to come through? How can I know that God's promises are true? God moves us, persuades us, convinces us that he can be counted on, that he's going to be there, that there's never, ever any reason to question his resolve. He says, I'll be there for you, even at the risk of facing a bloody and gruesome death. That's what's taking place here in Genesis chapter 15. And that's part of what takes place at the cross. As we fast forward thousands of years to the foot of the cross, and we see Jesus dying there on the cross, and we might ask, well, what's happening here? Why is this death taking place? And there are many ways to answer that question, each answer bringing some part of the truth. But this scene in Genesis 15 provides part of that truth. Jesus is dying on this cross to move us, to persuade us, to convince us that he too can be counted on, that he will be there, that there's never, ever any reason to question his resolve. On the cross, God is saying to us, I will be there with you, for you, even at the cost of death. I understand that entering into a relationship with you will be costly, will hurt, will cut. And yet, you are worth it. I will pay even that ultimate price to be in relationship and in partnership with you. Brennan Manning tells the story of how he came to have the name Brennan. He grew up in Brooklyn. His best friend was named Ray. And they did everything together. They bought their first cars together. They double dated together. They went through high school together. They enlisted in the army together. They fought on the front lines together. And one day, while fighting together on the front lines, they found themselves in a foxhole. And Brennan was reminiscing about those good old days back in Brooklyn and all the fun they used to have together. And all of a sudden, a grenade landed in their foxhole. And Brennan looked at Ray, and Ray looked at Brennan, and Ray jumped on the grenade as it exploded. And Ray was killed by the explosion, and Brennan survived. A few years later, Brennan decided to become a priest. And as part of becoming a priest, he was asked if he would like to take on the name of a saint. And he thought immediately of Ray Brennan. Now there's a saint, he thought. And so he took on the name Brennan Manning. And a few years later, he was visiting Ray's mother back in Brooklyn. And they were enjoying tea together. And Brennan asked her in the midst of that conversation, do you think that Ray loved me? And Mrs. Brennan got up off the couch and shook her finger in his face and said, what more could he have done for you to demonstrate his love for you? And Brennan said that in that moment, in that apartment, he had an epiphany. He envisioned himself standing at the foot of the cross, speaking to Mary, the mother of Jesus, and questioning Mary, do you think that Jesus loved me. And Mary, shaking her finger in his face, saying, what more could he have done for you? And in some ways, I think that is the point of Genesis 15. I think it is the point of the cross. It is God acting in a way. It is Jesus acting in a way. So that when those questions come, we can look at what God has done. We can look at what Jesus has done and realize there is nothing more they could have ever done to demonstrate their love for us. And we notice, of course, that God and Jesus do this regardless of what we do. Abram did not pass through the parts of the animals. We do not have to climb on the cross of Jesus Christ. God alone passed through that bloody path. Jesus alone dies on his cross. This is a one-sided commitment from God to us, proving in such a resolute way that we never, ever have to doubt his resolve toward us. Kate Ballard recently wrote this blessing for the kind of love that costs something. Love, she says, can break your heart. I think it's probably in the fine print. Blessed are you whose ability to love crosses differences and divides that would keep others apart. You who know this kind of love, life-expanding love, will cost you something, maybe everything. Blessed are you, whose heart has grown 3 sizes. Regardless, you who push through the fear of intimacy, the fear of loss, the fear of all the unknowns, and love still. Blessed are we, loving beyond our limits, loving when it doesn't make sense, loving without any lifetime guarantees, loving when it might break our hearts. And I think what Genesis 15 is saying to us and what the cross of Christ is saying to us is that God knew. God knew that entering into relationship with us would break his heart. It would stop his heart. But he loved anyway. He loved beyond limits. He loved all the way, even to death. And so Mother Teresa, long known as the servant of the poorest of the poor, once said, love to be real, it must cost, it must hurt, it must empty us of self. And I suppose that's a pretty good way of summarizing what takes place in Genesis 15, what took place on the cross. Not the sanitized versions that we see in visual representations like Dolly, not the sanitized versions that we often put up on our walls, around our necks, or carry around in our minds, but the real version of the cross. Jesus died in a way that showed us that his love is real, and that real love costs, and that real love hurts, but that every single one of us is worth that kind of